Lady Jasmine Brooks had made peace with spinsterhood approximately 2 weeks after her 24th birthday, following her 4th unsuccessful season in London and a particularly excruciating conversation with Lady Pembridge about the proper depth of a curtsy. The conversation had lasted 47 minutes. Jasmine had counted and had covered every imaginable variation of the curtsy, from the shallow dip appropriate for country squires to the deep reverence required for royalty, without once touching upon anything that might tax Lady Pembridge's limited capacity for original thought. Her peace treaty with fate had been simple. Never marry without genuine affection. Never pretend ignorance to attract a husband. These were radical positions in 1845 England, where a woman's intelligence was considered as welcome as a plague of locusts, and approximately as attractive. She'd spent 4 years watching eligible gentlemen prefer women who giggled rather than conversed, who never contradicted, who possessed the intellectual depth of teacups and seemed quite content with the arrangement. But there was one exception to her carefully constructed indifference, one name that made her traitorous heart perform acrobatics that would have impressed the performers at Astley's amphitheatre. Even thinking his name felt dangerous, like touching something beautiful that would burn her fingers. The memory lived in her mind with painful clarity: the Cambridge garden party 4 years ago, 20 glorious minutes discussing Mary Wollstonecraft and educational reform beneath a canopy of wisteria. He'd looked at her, truly looked at her, as though her thoughts were valuable rather than amusing, as though she were a person rather than a decorative object designed to sit quietly and pour tea. The current state of women's education is nothing short of criminal, she'd said, expecting him to change the subject as men always did. Instead, his grey eyes had lit with genuine interest. "You've read Wollstonecraft's Vindication?" "Twice," she'd admitted, bracing for mockery. "What did you think of her argument about sensibility versus rationality?" They debated philosophy like equals, like friends, like people who saw each other as fully human. Then Lady Caroline Ashford had appeared in silk the colour of champagne, dripping with jewels that caught the sunlight like captured stars, and Louis had excused himself with perfect politeness. The message had been clear as Thames water after a storm. Dukes didn't notice baronets' daughters who read philosophy and argued about women's education. They noticed women who looked like Lady Caroline and knew precisely how deep to curtsy. 4 years of seeing Louis from across ballrooms, 4 years of watching him dance with the most beautiful, accomplished women in England: Lady Caroline, Miss Thornbury, Lady Victoria, all of them performing elaborate mating rituals, while he remained perfectly courteous and perfectly distant. Perhaps 24 encounters since Cambridge, always at a distance, always with some stunning creature on his arm, never another conversation that mattered. Jasmine had maintained her dignity while her heart insisted on foolishness. She'd taught herself to look past him, to focus on her books and her charitable work and her small, quiet life in Kent. She'd almost convinced herself she was content. Then this rainy Tuesday morning in April, her father announced another tedious visitor. "Someone of considerable importance, Jasmine," Sir Edmund Brooks said at breakfast, not looking up from his correspondence. His tone suggested this visitor was different somehow, though everything was always considerable importance with her father. Last month, the vicar's nephew had been of considerable importance. The month before, a wool merchant from Yorkshire. "Do dress appropriately," he continued, finally glancing at her over his spectacles. "First impressions matter." Something inside Jasmine broke, not dramatically, not with thunder and lightning. It broke the way ice breaks in spring, quietly, inevitably, with a soft crack that changes everything. She was done. Done with corsets that squeezed until breathing required careful calculation. Done with elaborate hairstyles that pulled at her scalp for hours, leaving her head aching. Done with smiling politely at her father's associates, who treated her like decorative furniture, present for aesthetic purposes but not expected to contribute actual thoughts. Done with performing genteel femininity for men who assumed she couldn't understand their conversations about politics and philosophy and the actual interesting things happening in the world. If she had to endure another afternoon of aristocratic tedium, she would at least be comfortable. Her maid Margaret gasped when Jasmine announced her intentions. "My lady, you cannot mean to wear that dress. It's practically rags. Your father will be furious." "My father," Jasmine said calmly, pulling out her oldest day dress, the faded grey wool with the frayed hem and the small moth hole near the left sleeve, "has spent 28 years being disappointed in me. One more afternoon won't make any difference." She left her hair in a simple knot. No jewellery, no rouge, No effort whatsoever to be appealing. It felt glorious. It felt like rebellion. It felt like freedom. What Jasmine didn't know, as she made her rebellious decision, was that this particular visitor would change everything. The worst dress she owned was about to become the best decision of her life. 90 minutes later, Jasmine stood before her mirror with defiant satisfaction and creeping horror, engaged in a pitched battle for dominance of her emotions. The dress was muddy brown, worn for gardening last summer, stained at the hem with what might have been grass or possibly something worse that she preferred not to identify. It hung on her frame like a sack that had given up on life, possibly after being informed of its owner's poor decisions. The color made her look vaguely consumptive, as though she spent her days coughing delicately into handkerchiefs in drafty corners of the house. The hair situation was, if possible, even worse. She'd dismissed Betty, claiming a headache which wasn't entirely false, given that rebellion apparently came with side effects, and attempted to pin her hair herself, with catastrophic results. It was half falling around her shoulders like she'd been caught in a windstorm, or perhaps hadn't seen a mirror in several days. The effect was less artfully disheveled, and more recently escaped from asylum after lengthy incarceration. No jewelry graced her bare neck and wrists, no gloves covered her unadorned hands, no shawl softened the brutal lines of the dress. Nothing suggested she'd invested even minimal effort in her appearance, because she hadn't. This was the point. This was the entire glorious point of the exercise. Betty had actually gasped when she'd seen the final result, her hand flying to her mouth in genuine distress. "Miss Jasmine, you cannot possibly—" "I can and I will," Jasmine had interrupted with more confidence than she felt. "I'm properly covered, aren't I? Nothing scandalous, just profoundly unimpressive." Betty's expression had suggested she was watching someone commit social suicide by drowning themselves in poor fashion choices. "Your father will be so disappointed." "My father," Jasmine had said firmly, "will survive. He's survived 28 years of disappointment in me. What's one more afternoon?" The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Appear for the minimum time required by politeness. Say as little as possible. Retreat to the library at the first opportunity. Let whatever boring gentleman her father was courting, probably another wool merchant or minor politician desperate for respectability, barely register her presence, be so unremarkable he'd forget her by dinner. She descended the main staircase with her head high, prepared for her father's inevitable disappointment, perhaps even her mother's theatrical fainting spell, which Lady Brooks deployed with strategic precision whenever her daughter embarrassed her. What Jasmine wasn't prepared for, what she couldn't possibly have prepared for, was what awaited in the drawing room. She entered expecting some portly merchant with mutton chops, or perhaps an elderly politician seeking her father's favor. Instead, Louis Barnet, Duke of Cornwall, stood by the window. He was studying the rain-soaked gardens with his back partially turned, which gave Jasmine precisely 3 seconds to take in the impeccable tailoring of his charcoal coat, emphasizing shoulders that were broader than she remembered. It should be illegal how well that coat fit. The cut, the fabric, the way it moved with him as he shifted his weight, everything about it screamed expensive, elegant, utterly beyond her sphere. The man she'd loved for 4 years, the man she thought about when she read poetry late at night, the man whose smile she'd replayed in her mind approximately 7,000 times, who absolutely should not be seeing her like this. Jasmine stopped so abruptly she nearly tripped over her own feet. Her hand shot out to grip the doorframe for support, fingers digging into the wood hard enough that she'd probably leave marks. Every muscle in her body tensed with the overwhelming urge to flee, to run, to disappear into the walls like a sensible ghost. She took one step backward, then another, moving with the careful deliberation of someone backing away from a dangerous animal. Her heart was hammering so loud surely everyone in the room could hear it. Surely the servants 2 floors up could hear it. Surely half of Kent could hear the mortified pounding of Lady Jasmine Brooks's traitor heart as it realized the catastrophic magnitude of her mistake. This couldn't be happening. This was a nightmare. She would wake up any moment now in her comfortable bed, wearing her comfortable nightgown, and laugh at the absurdity of her subconscious mind, conjuring such a perfectly horrible scenario. Louis was here, actually here, in her drawing room, looking like he'd stepped out of a painting titled "Everything Jasmine Brooks Cannot Have," and she looked like she'd been dressed by someone who actively despised her and wished to punish her for unnamed crimes against humanity. Another step backward. If she could just reach the hallway, she could run. She was wearing sensible shoes, the only advantage of her terrible dress, and could probably make it to her room before anyone caught her. She could claim illness, plague, consumption to match her complexion, anything. Her father appeared in her peripheral vision, and she knew with the sick certainty of the doomed that escape was impossible. Before she could attempt it anyway, her father's voice rang out with obvious pride, the same tone he used when showing off his prize-hunting dogs. "Ah, Jasmine, excellent timing. May I present His Grace, the Duke of Cornwall?" Louis turned. Their eyes met. His expression shifted from polite interest to something Jasmine couldn't quite read: surprise, recognition, horror at her appearance. "All three? Your Grace," her father continued, oblivious to the fact that his daughter had stopped breathing entirely. "My daughter, Lady Jasmine Brooks." Jasmine's worst nightmare had just become her reality. She was trapped, utterly and completely trapped, in the worst dress she owned, facing the man she'd loved for 4 years. Her hair was falling down. She had no jewelry. She looked like a particularly unfortunate scarecrow. There was no escape now. "Your Grace, my daughter, Lady Jasmine Brooks." Her father's voice carried a note she couldn't quite place: pride, hope, desperation. Whatever it was, made her skin prickle with unease. This was hell. Actual, literal hell. Not the metaphorical kind she'd read about in Milton, but the real thing, specially designed to torture one Lady Jasmine Brooks for the sin of thinking she could rebel against societal expectations without consequences. Louis turned toward her fully, and Jasmine watched his expression with the fatalistic calm of someone watching an approaching tidal wave while standing on a beach with nowhere to run. She waited for the polite indifference she'd seen him give dozens of other unremarkable ladies at countless balls and dinners, for the barely concealed disappointment that inevitably crossed men's faces when they looked at her, the baronet's unfortunate daughter, who talked too much about the wrong things and couldn't manage to be decorative. Perhaps even pity for the poor creature, who apparently dressed herself in the dark and couldn't manage basic grooming. The dismissal, she thought with bitter certainty, would be swift. He wouldn't even remember this encounter by the time his carriage reached the main road. Instead, she got undisguised fascination. His grey eyes traveled over her disheveled appearance, the falling hair, the dreadful dress, the complete absence of any attempt at elegance, not with disgust, but with something that looked disturbingly like delight. One corner of his mouth curved upward in a slow smile that transformed his usually serious expression into something warm, genuine, and absolutely devastating. He was looking at her like she was the most interesting thing he'd seen in months, possibly years. Jasmine's brain stuttered to a complete halt. "Lady Jasmine." His deep voice sent shivers down her spine that she absolutely did not have time to analyze. What an unexpected pleasure. He stepped forward and bowed. Not the perfunctory nod most men gave unmarried ladies beneath their notice, the bare minimum required by etiquette before they turned their attention to more important people. A proper bow, respectful and deliberate, as if she was someone of consequence, as if her appearance didn't matter at all, as if she mattered. Jasmine's mind raced through her extremely limited options. Faint, too dramatic, and she'd never managed a convincing swoon even as a child. Claim sudden illness? Too obvious, given that she'd just walked into the room under her own power. Turn and run. Tempting deeply, powerfully tempting, but her father was watching with that peculiar expression, and running would require explanations she had no intention of providing. She was trapped. Utterly, completely trapped. Standing in her worst dress, facing the man she'd loved for 4 years, who was smiling at her like she was something precious rather than pathetic. She straightened her shoulders and salvaged what dignity remained in her possession, which felt approximately equivalent to a thimbleful of water in a drought. Dropping into a curtsy, technically correct even if the awful dress bunched awkwardly around her knees, she kept her eyes fixed on a point just past his left shoulder. "Your Grace, my father neglected to mention we'd be entertaining a duke today." Her voice came out sharper than intended, with an edge that probably qualified as impertinence. "Had I known, I might have made more." She gestured vaguely at herself, the movement encompassing the disaster of her entire presentation. Effort, heat flooded her cheeks. Wonderful. Now she was being actively rude to a duke, while looking like an unemployed governess who'd been recently dismissed for drinking the cooking sherry. This afternoon was going brilliantly. Louis's smile only widened, which made absolutely no sense according to any social rules Jasmine had spent 28 years learning. "On the contrary, Lady Jasmine, "I find your appearance refreshingly honest." He said it like he meant it, like he'd given the matter serious consideration and reached this conclusion after careful deliberation. "Most ladies spend hours constructing elaborate artifice for visitors. You apparently couldn't be bothered with such nonsense." He said it like it was admirable, like her complete lack of preparation was charming rather than mortifying, like she'd made a deliberate philosophical statement instead of having a small rebellion that had exploded spectacularly in her face. Jasmine stared at him, trying to understand what was happening. This wasn't how dukes behaved, especially not toward baronets' daughters in gardening dresses, not toward women who looked like they'd been dragged through a hedge backward and then beaten with the hedge for good measure. What was happening? Had he suffered a recent head injury? Was this some elaborate joke that would make sense later, when all his aristocratic friends appeared to laugh at the ridiculous lady who'd actually believed a duke might admire her dishevelment? Her father cleared his throat with the delicacy of someone interrupting a moment he didn't entirely understand, but found vaguely encouraging. "Perhaps we might sit. I've arranged for tea." He gestured toward the seating arrangement near the fireplace, the good chairs her mother insisted on keeping covered except for important visitors, which apparently included unexpected dukes who said bewildering things about honest appearances. Her mother would arrive any moment, Jasmine realized with fresh dread. Lady Brooks, who had fainted dead away last month when Jasmine had suggested women should perhaps be allowed to attend university. This afternoon was just beginning, and it was already a catastrophe of epic proportions. Jasmine moved toward the indicated chair on legs that felt distinctly unsteady, as though her knees had decided they'd had quite enough of this nonsense and were considering resignation. She was hyper-aware of Louis taking the seat directly across from her, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker grey in his eyes, like storm clouds gathering. Close enough to smell his cologne, something woodsy and expensive that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe, including the good dresses. He was still watching her with that inexplicable expression, still smiling, as though sitting across from a disaster was exactly how he'd hoped to spend his Tuesday afternoon. Why was he still smiling? As the maid entered with the tea service, her shoes clicking precisely against the polished floor, Jasmine realized with growing alarm that this wasn't going to be a brief, forgettable encounter. Louis Barnet, Duke of Cornwall, showed no signs of polite dismissal or barely concealed boredom. Instead, he settled into his chair like a man preparing for a long, fascinating conversation, crossing one ankle over his knee with casual elegance. And he was looking at her in her catastrophic dress and chaotic hair like she was exactly where he wanted to be. Her mother swept in like a ship under full sail, took one look at Jasmine, and nearly dropped the teapot. To her credit, Lady Brooks recovered with the admirable aristocratic composure that came from 30 years of pretending shocking things weren't happening right in front of her face. "Your Grace, how delightful to receive you." Her mother's voice could have cut glass with its brightness. Her eyes, however, kept darting to Jasmine's dress with barely concealed horror, as though the garment might spontaneously combust and take the family's reputation with it. She began pouring tea with practiced grace despite her obvious distress, the delicate clink of china, the only sound beyond the relentless rain against the windows. Her father and Louis resumed their conversation, something about land management in Cornwall, irrigation systems for the Duke's estates, modern approaches to tenant farming practices that apparently required extensive consultation. Jasmine tried to focus on her tea, tried to become invisible through sheer force of will, tried not to notice how Louis's voice rumbled pleasantly when he discussed crop rotation. Then he interrupted her father mid-sentence about drainage systems. "Lady Jasmine," Louis said suddenly, and her entire body tensed like a rabbit hearing the snap of a twig. "I recall we once discussed Mary Wollstonecraft at the Cambridge garden party. 4 years ago, wasn't it?" The world tilted again. "Do you still read philosophy?" he remembered. 4 years ago. 20 minutes of conversation in a garden full of people, and he remembered. Jasmine's teacup froze halfway to her lips. She stared at him in absolute disbelief, trying to reconcile this reality with every assumption she'd made about that afternoon, about the 4 years since, about everything. Yes, Your Grace." She could barely form coherent words, "though my reading has expanded somewhat since then." "Oh?" He leaned forward with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, not the polite interest people feigned when trapped in tedious conversations. "What captures your interest these days?" His grey eyes were intent on her face, not making polite small talk but actually interested, waiting for her answer like it mattered, like her thoughts were worth the air required to voice them. This felt like a trap. Men didn't actually want to know what women read. They wanted to hear about romantic novels or household management guides, or perhaps something safely musical. They certainly didn't want honest answers. But something in his expression, an openness, an authentic curiosity, made her answer honestly despite every self-protective instinct screaming at her to lie. "I've been reading John Stuart Mill's work on representative government." The words came out in a rush. "Some additional texts on educational reform as well. Harriet Martineau's essays on social economics. Whatever I can obtain, really, though finding such material in Kent requires creative approaches to library management." Her mother made a small, pained sound like a mouse being stepped on. Her father's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline, disappearing into his thinning hair with impressive speed. Here came the polite dismissal, Jasmine thought with weary resignation. The subtle mockery disguised as charming surprise, the gentle redirection toward topics more suitable for ladies. Instead, Louis leaned even further forward, abandoning all pretense of proper posture, elbows on his knees. His entire attention focused on her with an intensity that made her heart race and her palms sweat against her teacup. "Mill's essays are rather revolutionary, Lady Jasmine." His voice was low, warm. "Though I suspect most of London society would consider us both radical for admitting we've read them." A pause, during which Jasmine forgot how to breathe. "I find his arguments about representative democracy particularly compelling. His views on women's suffrage are ahead of their time, don't you think?" He'd not only read them, he agreed with them. He was discussing them with her like she was an intellectual equal, not patronizing or mocking or dismissive. He was actually engaging. The next hour dissolved into the strangest, most wonderful confusion of Jasmine's entire life. Her father and Louis completed their business discussions agreements about Cornwall's agricultural modernization, schedules for future consultations. But every few minutes, Louis directed questions to her about books, about the recent political debates in Parliament, about social reform movements, about whether the railway expansion would fundamentally alter English society beyond simple transportation improvements. He asked like he cared about her answers, like her thoughts mattered, like she was a person whose intelligence he respected rather than tolerated. And the way he looked at her, not at her catastrophic dress or her disastrous hair, but at her face, her eyes, as if she were the most fascinating person in the room. It was intoxicating and terrifying and completely inexplicable. "Do you think the Corn Law's repeal will prove beneficial in the long term?" he asked at one point, and her mother actually gasped. "I think," Jasmine said carefully, aware that she was walking a tightrope between honesty and social suicide, "that free trade principles will ultimately benefit the working classes more than protective tariffs ever could, though the short-term disruption will be painful for landowners. But economic policy shouldn't exist solely to protect aristocratic interests." She waited for offense. Instead, Louis smiled like she'd given him a gift. An hour passed, then another. Her mother had given up attempting to steer the conversation toward appropriate topics like the weather or the recent improvements to the rose garden. Her father watched their exchange with an expression Jasmine couldn't interpret. Was that approval? Amusement? Hope? Finally, as the afternoon light began to fade and the rain showed no signs of stopping, Louis rose to take his leave. "Sir Edmund, thank you for your time and expertise." He shook her father's hand with obvious warmth. "I'm confident our collaborative approach will prove beneficial for Cornwall's agricultural development." He turned to her mother with impeccable politeness. "Lady Brooks, thank you for your hospitality and excellent tea." Then he looked at Jasmine, and his expression softened into something that made her heart perform impossible acrobatics that defied all known laws of anatomy. "Lady Jasmine, this has been the most enjoyable afternoon I've spent in Kent." A pause, during which the world held its breath. "Perhaps ever." Jasmine stood, her catastrophic dress bunching awkwardly again around her knees. "Your Grace, I suspect you're being absurdly kind, given that I look like I've been sleeping rough in a ditch." "I think," Louis said quietly, his grey eyes holding hers with unwavering intensity, "you look like someone who doesn't waste time on pretense. It's remarkably attractive." He bowed to her another proper, respectful bow that made her feel precious rather than pathetic, and then he was gone. As the door closed behind the Duke, Jasmine stood frozen in the drawing room, her cold tea forgotten, her mind reeling. What in heaven's name had just happened? The man she'd loved for 4 years had just spent 2 hours treating her in her worst dress, with her disastrous hair like she was the most interesting woman in England. And unless she was completely mad, he'd looked at her like he wanted to come back. If you're as captivated by Jasmine and Louis's unconventional beginning as we are, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing. Your engagement helps us continue sharing stories about love that defies expectations. Let's see what happens next after she wore her poorest dress for her father's guest. The moment the door closed behind the Duke, her mother moved to Jasmine's side with the speed of someone who'd been physically restraining herself for the past 2 hours. Her expression was a complicated mixture of disapproval and cautious hope, like she'd bitten into something that might be either poison or the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted. "Jasmine, what on earth was that?" Her voice caught between scandal and excitement. "The Duke of Cornwall looked at you as if you'd hung the moon and stars themselves. While you were wearing," she gestured helplessly at the catastrophic dress. "That, I have absolutely no idea, Mother." Jasmine was still processing, her heart still racing like she'd run from London to Kent without stopping. "I wore my worst dress specifically to be unmemorable, to fade into the furniture and escape to the library at the first opportunity." She gestured helplessly at her catastrophic ensemble, which somehow looked even worse now that Louis wasn't there, making it feel irrelevant. Her mother sat down heavily, her fan waving with agitated precision. "Well, you certainly failed at that objective. In all my years, and I've been navigating society for 3 decades, I've never seen a duke look at anyone like that, particularly not at someone dressed for," she paused, searching for words, "aggressive gardening. Jasmine." Her father's voice came from the doorway, serious in a way that made her stomach clench. "Might I have a word?" She followed him to his study on legs that felt distinctly unsteady, like a newborn foal attempting its first steps. He closed the door behind them and leaned against his desk, studying her with the expression he'd worn when she was a child, the look he got when solving complex problems that required careful consideration. "Did you know the Duke was visiting today?" "Absolutely not." The words came out more forcefully than intended. "If I'd known, I would have." She gestured at her dress with something approaching hysteria. "Well, I certainly wouldn't have looked like this. I was making a point about tedious visitors, not attempting to offend a duke." She was near tears of mortification, the full weight of the afternoon finally crushing down on her shoulders. Her father's lips twitched with what appeared to be suppressed amusement. "The Duke seems remarkably unbothered by your creative fashion choices. In fact, I'd say quite the opposite." "I don't understand it, Father." Jasmine's voice cracked slightly. "He's the most eligible man in England, possibly Europe. He could have his pick of any lady, beautiful, accomplished, properly dressed ladies who know how to conduct themselves appropriately. Why would he possibly be interested in—" She couldn't finish the sentence. It was too painful, too exposing. Her father moved closer, his expression gentling in the way it did when she was small and had scraped her knees, climbing trees her mother insisted were unladylike. "My dear girl, perhaps that's precisely why. Perhaps he's tired of beautiful, accomplished ladies who perform for him like trained circus animals. Perhaps he finds your authenticity refreshing." "Authenticity," Jasmine repeated flatly. "Is that what we're calling catastrophically underdressed now? Because I have several other words for it, none of them flattering." She was half laughing, half crying, the emotional whiplash of the afternoon finally catching up with her. "I'm calling it being yourself," her father said quietly, "and apparently the Duke of Cornwall finds yourself rather captivating." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, something that made Jasmine's breath catch. He asked permission to call again. Jasmine's head snapped up so quickly her neck protested. "He what?" The world tilted sideways for the 3rd time that afternoon. She gripped her father's desk for support, her knuckles white against the dark wood. "Tomorrow afternoon, if that's acceptable to you." Her father was watching her carefully now, as if gauging her reaction. "He specifically asked permission to call on you, Jasmine. Not on me, not on the family generally. On you." The implication crashed over her like a wave. This wasn't business courtesy. This wasn't polite social obligation. This was courtship. Actual, intentional courtship. Louis Barnett wanted to see her again, deliberately, purposefully, and had asked permission like a gentleman with serious intentions. "Perhaps this time," her father said with a genuine smile, "wear whatever makes you comfortable. Clearly, your instincts were better than anyone expected." Jasmine walked back to her chamber in a daze, her mind spinning through the afternoon's impossible events like a carousel that wouldn't stop. Betty met her at the door, took one look at her expression, and immediately asked, "Miss, are you quite well? You look as though you've seen a ghost." "The Duke of Cornwall is calling tomorrow." Jasmine said the words slowly, testing them, trying to make them feel real. "Specifically to see me." She still couldn't believe it. Didn't dare believe it. Betty actually squealed with delight, a sound that probably violated at least 3 rules of proper servant decorum. "Miss Jasmine, the Duke. Oh, we must plan your dress immediately." She was already moving toward the wardrobe with military efficiency, pulling out gowns and holding them up to the fading light. "Something elegant, something that shows your figure properly, something that says, 'No, Betty.'" Jasmine's voice was firmer than she'd expected. No elaborate preparation. If Louis Barnett was truly interested in her, and that was still a monumentally large if that she couldn't quite wrap her mind around, then he was interested in the actual her. Not some polished, performative version designed to attract husbands. Not the Jasmine who spent 3 hours getting dressed and another hour practicing appropriate facial expressions. "But miss, you can't possibly wear." Betty gestured at the current catastrophe still hanging on Jasmine's frame. "You need to look your best. I need to look like myself." Jasmine moved to the window overlooking the Kent countryside, the fields stretching out in the grey afternoon light. "If he's interested in me, it's because I wasn't trying to impress him. I won't start performing now. I can't." She couldn't explain it better than that, the bone-deep certainty that whatever had happened this afternoon had happened because she'd been authentically, catastrophically herself. Somewhere in London, Louis was probably going about his ducal business, managing estates, attending to correspondence, doing whatever dukes did, when they weren't inexplicably visiting baronets in Kent, probably already forgetting this strange afternoon. Except he'd asked to call again. He'd looked at her like she mattered. He'd remembered Cambridge, 4 years ago, 20 minutes of conversation in a garden, and he'd smiled at her in the worst dress in Christendom like she was wearing silk and diamonds. Perhaps the universe wasn't cruel after all. Perhaps it simply had a very strange sense of timing and an inexplicable fondness for irony. Tomorrow she'd find out if this afternoon had been real or merely a wonderful hallucination brought on by wishful thinking and too much hope. Tomorrow, Louis Barnett would return, and Jasmine, for possibly the first time in 4 years, allowed herself the dangerous luxury of hope. But she had no idea that tomorrow would bring not just one revelation, but several, each more shocking than the last. The Duke of Cornwall had plans, and Jasmine Brooks was at the center of every single one. Jasmine spent the evening in controlled panic, attempting to read Mill's essay on liberty and finding herself staring at the same paragraph for 20 minutes while comprehending absolutely nothing. Her mind kept replaying the afternoon's events like a broken music box, the same moments spinning round and round until they lost all meaning. At dinner, her mother tried engaging her about appropriate topics for tomorrow's visit. "Perhaps discuss the weather, dear, or inquire politely about his Cornwall estates. But do try not to argue about philosophy or women's suffrage or any of those other topics that give me palpitations." Her father watched with an inscrutable expression, smiling into his wineglass like he knew something amusing that he had no intention of sharing. By bedtime, Jasmine had convinced herself she'd imagined everything. Louis would send a polite note in the morning, unexpectedly called away to Cornwall or Scotland, or anywhere that wasn't here. Dukes didn't actually call on unremarkable baronets' daughters just because they'd had one interesting conversation. That wasn't how the world worked. She was wrong. The next afternoon, precisely 3 o'clock, the butler announced with barely concealed excitement, "Your Grace, the Duke of Cornwall." Jasmine nearly dropped the book she'd been pretending to read while perched on the drawing-room chair for the past 40 minutes, attempting to appear casual rather than desperately anxious. Louis entered and stopped immediately, his dark grey eyes finding her with unnerving precision. His face lit with the same warm smile from yesterday, and he was even more handsome than she remembered, which seemed scientifically impossible but was nevertheless true. Today he wore a navy blue coat that made his shoulders look impossibly wider. His dark hair was slightly mussed, as though he'd been running his fingers through it, and there was a slight crease between his brows, like he'd been concentrating on something serious before arriving. "Lady Jasmine." His deep voice sent shivers down her spine that she had no business feeling in her parents' drawing room. "I hope I'm not intruding." She stood quickly, dropped into a curtsy that was technically correct if somewhat hasty. Today's dress was a simple day dress in pale green, Betty had insisted it was perfectly appropriate without being overly formal. She'd actually allowed her maid to properly arrange her hair this time, reasoning that one catastrophic appearance per courtship was probably sufficient. The result was presentable if not remarkable. She half expected disappointment in his expression, as if yesterday's disaster had held some bizarre appeal that today's respectability lacked. Instead, he gave her that thoughtful look, his gaze traveling over her neat appearance with careful attention, one eyebrow lifted slightly. "You look lovely, Lady Jasmine." A pause, during which her heart forgot how to beat properly. "Though I confess I was rather charmed by yesterday's ensemble." Heat flooded her cheeks with the force of a tidal wave. "Your Grace, you're either remarkably kind or remarkably dishonest. That dress was a catastrophe of truly epic proportions." It was honest. He moved closer, and she could smell that woodsy cologne again. "You wore exactly what you wanted without caring what anyone thought." I found that rather liberating to witness. Her mother, who'd been sitting discreetly by the window with her embroidery, made a small, pleased sound that suggested wedding bells were already ringing in her imagination. Louis turned toward her with impeccable politeness. "Lady Brooks, I hope you'll forgive my requesting a few moments of your daughter's time. Perhaps a walk in your garden? It's a remarkably pleasant afternoon." Her mother looked like Christmas had arrived 6 months early. "Of course, Your Grace. Jasmine, do take your shawl." 2 minutes later, Jasmine found herself walking beside a duke through her family's gardens. Her mother was watching from the window, proper chaperoning, but at a distance technically appropriate, yet far enough away that their conversation would remain private. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Jasmine's heart hammered so loudly she was certain he could hear it. This was bizarre. Impossible. She was walking with Louis Barnett like it was a perfectly normal thing to do. "I've been thinking about you since yesterday," he said abruptly. Jasmine nearly tripped over her own feet. "I beg your pardon." He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious now in a way that made her breath catch. "Lady Jasmine, I'm going to be remarkably forward, which may be inappropriate, but I suspect you'd prefer honesty to polite dancing around the subject." Yes, actually, I would." Her heart was racing fast enough to power one of those new steam engines. "What is it?" He took a breath, and she saw something on the face of England's most eligible bachelor that she'd never expected to see: nervousness. "I've attended approximately 40 social events this season. Balls, soirees, musicales, dinner parties. At each one, I've been surrounded by accomplished, beautiful young ladies who laugh at my jokes, agree with everything I say, and perform elaborate displays designed to catch my attention." Jasmine's heart began to sink. Of course, he was going to explain why those women were preferable to odd girls who wore horrible dresses and argued about politics. "It's exhausting," he said flatly, and her sinking heart stopped mid-descent. "Being constantly performed for, never knowing if someone is genuinely interested in conversation or merely interested in becoming a duchess. I've spent 4 years feeling like an object to be acquired rather than a person to be known." He moved closer, and Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. "And then, yesterday, I walked into your father's drawing room and saw you, windswept hair, truly terrible dress, looking at me like you'd rather be literally anywhere else." He smiled, and it transformed his entire face. "And you were the most refreshing thing I'd seen in years." "Refreshing is a very diplomatic word for disastrous," Jasmine managed, though she could barely breathe. "No, honest, real." He was close enough now that she could see the darker flecks of grey in his eyes. "When I asked about your reading, you didn't pretend to only read poetry or romantic novels. You told me you've been reading Mill and didn't care if I found it inappropriate. When I commented on your appearance, you practically called me a liar to my face." A surprised laugh escaped her. "That was appallingly rude of me." "That was gloriously honest," he corrected firmly. "Lady Jasmine, do you know how many genuine conversations I've had with young ladies in the past 4 years? Conversations where they actually disagreed with me, challenged my opinions, said something unpredictable." She shook her head, afraid to hope, afraid to believe where this was going. "None. Not one." His voice was quiet now, intense. "Until yesterday. Until you." They'd reached a small bench beneath an arbor heavy with climbing roses, the scent sweet and almost overwhelming. As Louis gestured for her to sit, Jasmine realized this conversation was far from over, and the way he was looking at her with an intensity that made her knees weak suggested that what he was about to say next would change everything. She sat down, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her skirts. Louis settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough to be slightly improper, even with her mother watching from the window. "I'm not explaining this well," he admitted, and Jasmine's heart began to race even faster. Louis Julian sat close enough that she could smell his cologne again, woody and expensive and utterly intoxicating. He turned to face her directly, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration that explained the must appearance. "I'm not explaining this well," he said. "I'm making it sound like I only value you for being different, which is reductive and unfair." He took a breath, his grey eyes intense enough to make her forget how to breathe properly. "The truth is, Lady Jasmine," another breath, "I've been half in love with you since Cambridge, since that garden party 4 years ago." "What?" The word emerged barely above a whisper. She couldn't have heard him correctly. It was impossible. "We spoke for perhaps 20 minutes about Wollstonecraft," he continued, his voice gaining conviction. "About educational reform, women's rights to education. You quoted passages from memory, argued with passion and intelligence that made my heart race. I remember thinking, finally, someone interesting. But you left." Her voice cracked, 4 years of pain condensed into 3 words. "Lady Caroline arrived and you left." "Because I was terrified," he admitted quietly. "You were utterly captivating, and I was a young duke who'd been told his entire life that marriage was a strategic decision. I convinced myself that attraction and genuine interest weren't sufficient foundation for courtship. I told myself I needed to be practical, to choose someone appropriate and accomplished," Jasmine said quietly, bitterly. "And beautiful. You are beautiful." He said it with such conviction that her head snapped up. "Good God, Jasmine, you're beautiful. But more than that, you're brilliant and funny and honest. You don't pretend to be less than you are to make men comfortable. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How precious?" She stared at him, trying to process words that contradicted everything she'd believed for 4 years. "Your Grace." "Julian," he interrupted. "Please, Jasmine, call me Julian." Using his Christian name felt dangerous, thrilling, terrifying all at once. "Julian." She tested the name on her tongue. "I've spent 4 years watching you dance with the most beautiful women in England. Why would you possibly—" "Because those women bore me senseless," he said bluntly, and then began listing examples with the precision of a man who'd given this considerable thought. "Lady Victoria Sterling never expressed a single opinion that wasn't calculated to agree with mine. Miss Catherine Thornbury spoke exclusively about the weather and watercolours. Lady Caroline Ashford spent an entire evening discussing bonnets. Bonnets, Jasmine, for 3 hours. Despite everything, the impossibility of the situation, the overwhelming emotion, Jasmine laughed. He was serious. Actually, genuinely serious. "I don't want a wife who performs for me," he continued earnestly, leaning closer. "I don't want someone who sees me as a title to acquire, a prize to be won. I want someone who argues about philosophy, someone who wears terrible dresses when she can't be bothered with social expectations, someone who looks at me like I'm a person rather than a prize." His hand moved to cover hers on the bench, warm and gentle and achingly careful. "Someone like you, Jasmine." She looked down at their hands, her throat tight with emotion she couldn't name. "I don't understand. Yesterday morning I was nobody, just a baronet's ordinary daughter who failed to secure a husband after 4 seasons. And now you're saying—" "You were never nobody," he interrupted fiercely. "You were always remarkable. I was simply too cowardly to pursue what I actually wanted instead of what everyone expected me to want." "And what do you want?" The question emerged barely above a whisper. The world seemed to hold its breath. Julian's thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, the gesture so intimate it made her dizzy. "I want to court you, Jasmine, properly, openly. I want to spend afternoons discussing books and arguing about politics. I want to learn what makes you laugh, what makes you angry, what you dream about when you're alone." He paused, his grey eyes searching hers with intensity that made her feel transparent. "I want you to know that someone sees you, truly sees you, and finds you absolutely extraordinary." Tears pricked at her eyes. 4 years of believing she was simultaneously too much and not enough. 4 years of watching Julian from afar, assuming he'd never notice her. 4 years of carefully managed disappointment and resigned acceptance. "This is mad," she managed. "People will think you've lost your senses, courting someone like me." "Let them think what they like," he said firmly. "I've spent too much time caring about other people's opinions. I'm done with that." She looked at him, really looked, and saw something she'd missed before. Beneath the ducal confidence and devastating handsomeness, Julian Barnett was lonely, tired of being performed for. He wanted what she'd always wanted, to be known for who he actually was, rather than what he represented. "I've loved you for 4 years," she blurted out, then immediately wanted to sink into the earth and disappear forever. "Oh, heavens, I shouldn't have said that. That's far too forward." Julian's face transformed. His smile was brilliant, joy radiating from every feature with such intensity it was almost painful to witness. "Say it again." "Absolutely not." But she was smiling through her tears. "Please, Jasmine, say it again." "I will not." It was mortifyingly inappropriate. He leaned closer, his free hand cupping her jaw with infinite gentleness. "Jasmine Brooks, you are the most wonderful surprise of my life. And if you've loved me for 4 years whilst I was too blind to see what was right in front of me, then I have considerable time to make up for." His thumb brushed across her cheek. They were technically in view of her mother's window, perfectly appropriate by 1845 courtship standards, but the intimacy of the gesture made her feel like they were the only 2 people in the world. "May I court you?" he asked softly. "Properly, with your parents' blessing and society's knowledge? May I take you driving in Hyde Park, escort you to the opera, bore you with agricultural discussions about Cornwall sheep farming?" She laughed, tears spilling over despite her efforts to contain them. "You're serious? You're actually serious?" "Devastatingly serious." His grey eyes held hers with unwavering intensity. "Say yes, Jasmine. Give me the chance to prove I'm worthy of 4 years of your secret affection." There were 1,000 reasons to be cautious, to protect her heart, to question his motivations. But Julian was looking at her like she was precious, like she mattered, like she was enough exactly as she was. Jasmine took a breath, knowing that her answer would change everything, would open her heart to the possibility of the happiness she'd only dreamed of, or the devastation of losing it all. The word hovered on her lips, and Julian waited, his grey eyes full of hope and something that looked remarkably like love. "Yes," the word emerged as a whisper, but it felt like shouting. "Yes, Julian, you may court me." His smile could have powered every gas lamp in England. "Thank God. I was prepared to grovel if necessary." "I would have enjoyed watching that," Jasmine admitted. "I'm certain you would have." He stood, helping her to her feet with easy grace. "Now, shall we inform your parents that I've utterly lost my senses and intend to pursue their brilliant, argumentative daughter? They'll think you've gone mad." "Excellent," Julian said cheerfully. "I've always wanted to be the source of scandalized gossip. Builds character." They walked back toward the house, Jasmine's hand tucked into the crook of Julian's arm. Through the drawing-room window, she could see her mother watching with barely contained excitement, her embroidery completely abandoned. "Jasmine." Julian stopped walking as they approached the terrace, turning to face her with sudden seriousness. "What happens when you realize I'm not actually extraordinary? When the novelty of my honesty wears off and you remember there are dozens of beautiful, accomplished ladies who'd make much more suitable duchesses." He stopped walking, faced her fully, his expression serious in a way that made her heart ache. "Jasmine, I've spent 4 years surrounded by those ladies. I know exactly what they offer. What I don't know, what I'm desperate to discover, is everything about you. Your favorite books and least favorite social obligations. Whether you can play the pianoforte or if you share my complete inability to carry a tune." "I'm a terrible musician," she confessed. "Absolutely dreadful. My music teacher said I had the natural rhythm of a wounded elephant." "Perfect," Julian said with obvious delight. "We can be dreadful together. I once made my music teacher quit by attempting Mozart. She claimed I'd ruined Requiem for her permanently." Despite herself, Jasmine laughed. "That's actually impressive in its own terrible way. I have hidden depths of incompetence. You'll discover them all, I promise." They entered the drawing room to find both parents waiting with barely concealed curiosity. Her mother's embroidery lay forgotten in her lap. Her father had emerged from his study and was standing by the fireplace, trying to appear casual while clearly desperate to know what had transpired in the garden. Julian addressed them formally, though Jasmine could see the suppressed smile tugging at his mouth. "Sir Edmund, Lady Brooks, I've had the honor of requesting permission to formally court your daughter. With your blessing, I'd like to call upon Lady Jasmine regularly and escort her to appropriate social engagements." Her mother looked like she might faint from happiness, clutching her handkerchief like a lifeline. Her father's expression shifted to something calculating, not suspicious, but protective. "Your Grace, Might I ask what your intentions are regarding my daughter? Honorable, Julian said immediately. Completely honorable. I intend to court Lady Jasmine properly, give her time to determine whether my regard is returned, and should she find me acceptable, to eventually request her hand in marriage. The word marriage hung in the air like church bells. Julian had just announced his intention to marry her. Jasmine felt lightheaded and gripped the chair back for support. Her father studied Julian for a long moment, then glanced at Jasmine. Whatever he saw in her expression satisfied him. He nodded slowly. Very well, Your Grace. You have my permission to court Jasmine. However, I expect you to treat her with appropriate respect and consideration. I wouldn't dream of doing otherwise, Julian said quietly. Your daughter is extraordinary. She deserves nothing less than the utmost respect. Her mother had apparently lost the ability to speak entirely. She simply nodded enthusiastically, still clutching her handkerchief, her eyes suspiciously bright. Julian stayed for another hour, taking tea and engaging in perfectly proper conversation, whilst simultaneously catching Jasmine's eye repeatedly, smiling like they shared a wonderful secret, which they did. Finally, he took his leave. He bowed over Jasmine's hand, holding it a moment longer than strictly necessary. Tomorrow afternoon, might I take you driving in Hyde Park? Around 4 o'clock, when all of society will be present to witness the Duke of Cornwall courting the incomparable Lady Jasmine Brooks. You want to make a spectacle? She asked, half amused, half alarmed. I want everyone to know, Julian corrected firmly. I've wasted 4 years. I'm not wasting another moment hiding what I want. After his departure, her mother immediately burst into excited chatter about what Jasmine should wear for Hyde Park, which bonnets were most flattering, which shawls complemented which dresses. Her father caught Jasmine's eye and gestured toward his study. She followed, still floating somewhere between disbelief and joy. Are you certain about this, my dear? He asked gently once the door closed. The Duke is rather overwhelming. His attentions will come with considerable public scrutiny. I know, Papa. She met his eyes steadily. I've loved him for 4 years. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it doesn't sound ridiculous at all, he interrupted. I fell in love with your mother after one dance. These things happen. He paused, his expression growing more serious. But love alone isn't always sufficient for happiness. Can you trust him, Jasmine? Can you trust that his regard is genuine? She thought about Julian's nervous confession in the garden, the loneliness in his eyes, the way he'd looked at her in her terrible dress like she was something precious. Yes, she said quietly, I can trust him. He's as lonely as I've been, Papa, just for different reasons. Her father pulled her into a hug rare and therefore precious. Then I'm happy for you, darling girl, though I suspect your mother is already planning a wedding that will bankrupt us all. Jasmine laughed against his shoulder. I haven't even been properly courted yet. Details, her father said dryly. Minor, insignificant details. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every gesture, every smile from the past 2 days. Tomorrow she would ride through Hyde Park beside Julian Barnet, and all of London would see. All the beautiful ladies who danced with him would witness the Duke of Cornwall courting a baronet's unremarkable daughter. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something that might be triumph. She'd worn her worst dress and captured the heart of the man she loved. If that wasn't proof that honesty was its own reward, she didn't know what was. Tomorrow, the real challenge would begin learning to believe she deserved this impossible happiness. But tonight, she allowed herself the luxury of joy. What Jasmine didn't know, as she drifted off to sleep with a smile on her face, was that tomorrow's Hyde Park appearance would trigger a social earthquake. The Ton was about to witness something unprecedented. A duke choosing authenticity over perfection, substance over performance. And not everyone would be pleased. Lady Caroline Ashford, in particular, was about to make her displeasure very, very clear. We've reached the climactic moment where Jasmine and Julian face society together. If this story of love, courage, and authenticity has moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support means everything. Remember how she wore her poorest dress for her father's guest and changed her destiny? Now let's see how that decision transforms not just her life, but challenges society itself. The next afternoon, Jasmine worried about her dress, a lovely but unremarkable pale blue walking dress that Betty insisted was perfect. She worried about her bonnet, a simple straw with modest ribbon. She worried about what to say, how to sit properly in Julian's curricle. whether she'd somehow humiliate herself in front of all of London. What she didn't anticipate was the sheer spectacle of Julian courting someone openly. He arrived precisely at 4 o'clock in a curricle, clearly designed to be noticed, glossy black, with the ducal insignia on the doors, pulled by perfectly matched greys that probably cost more than most people's houses. Julian himself was devastatingly handsome in a dark blue coat and buff-colored breeches, his dark hair artfully windswept in a way that probably required considerable effort to achieve. He handed her into the curricle with exquisite care, his touch lingering on her gloved hand a moment longer than necessary. "You look beautiful," he murmured low enough that only she could hear. "I look perfectly ordinary," she protested, settling her skirts. "You look like yourself," he said, climbing up beside her and taking the reins, "which makes you considerably more interesting than anyone else we're about to encounter." Hyde Park, at 4 o'clock, was a crush of elegant vehicles, immaculate horses, and society's most fashionable members displaying themselves like peacocks. Jasmine recognized dozens of faces, ladies from previous seasons, gentlemen who danced with her once and never asked again, matrons whose approval could make or break a reputation. Every single one stopped talking when Julian's curricle entered the park. "Oh dear," Jasmine muttered. "This is rather dramatic." "Wait for it," Julian said cheerfully, guiding the horses into the fashionable circuit. Lady Pemberton nearly drove her barouche into a tree while gaping at them. Miss Catherine Thornbury's face showed pure shock and dismay. Lady Caroline Ashford, resplendent in a riding habit that probably cost more than Jasmine's entire wardrobe, pulled her horse to a complete stop and simply watched them pass with narrowed, furious eyes. "Everyone is staring," Jasmine hissed. "Excellent. That's rather the point." Julian nodded politely to a cluster of dowagers, whose expressions suggested they were witnessing something scandalous. "The point of what?" "Making it clear I'm unavailable." He steered past Lord and Lady Winchester's phaeton with easy skill. "I've spent 4 years being diplomatically evasive about my marital intentions. This," he gestured between them, "is me being explicitly clear about where my interests lie." An elderly gentleman Jasmine didn't recognize removed his hat and bowed deeply as they passed. Julian returned the gesture with perfect dignity whilst murmuring, "That's Lord Ashford. He'll tell at least 15 people about this before dinner." "You're enjoying this," Jasmine realized. "Actually enjoying creating a scandal." "Not a scandal, a statement. There's a difference." He glanced at her, his grey eyes warm. "Are you uncomfortable?" "We can leave if you'd prefer," she considered. She'd spent 4 years being invisible, overlooked, considered unremarkable. Now the Duke of Cornwall was publicly claiming her attention in front of everyone who dismissed her. "No," she said slowly. "I think I'm rather enjoying it too." His answering smile was brilliant. "There's my brave girl." They completed one circuit, then another. Each pass brought more whispers, more stares, more barely concealed shock. Julian remained perfectly composed, acknowledging acquaintances with polite nods, while keeping his attention primarily on Jasmine. He asked her opinions on the spring weather, whether the new plantings near the Serpentine were an improvement, if she'd read the latest Dickens installment. Perfectly ordinary conversation, made remarkable by who was having it. On their third circuit came the inevitable confrontation. Lady Caroline positioned her elegant phaeton directly in their path, forcing Julian to stop. "Your Grace, what a surprise." Her voice carried aristocratic sweetness that meant trouble. And Lady Jasmine, "How unexpected." Lady Caroline, "Lovely afternoon, isn't it?" Julian's politeness was impeccable. Caroline's blue eyes flickered between them, calculating. "Indeed, Your Grace. I believe you'd promised me a drive in the park. Was that not mentioned at the Pemberton soirée last week?" "I believe you may be misremembering," Julian said smoothly. "I made no such commitment." The lie was polite but obvious. Jasmine had seen Julian dance with Caroline at that soirée, had watched from across the room while managing her jealousy with practiced discipline. Caroline's smile froze. "I see. How interesting that your memory differs from mine." "Memory is a fallible thing," Julian said. "Now, if you'll excuse us." "Lady Jasmine," Caroline interrupted, turning her full attention to Jasmine. Her expression reminded Jasmine of a snake evaluating a small mouse. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced, though we've certainly seen each other at various events. You've been rather quiet during the past few seasons, haven't you?" The implication was clear. Unremarkable, forgettable, beneath notice. Something in Jasmine snapped. Perhaps it was 4 years of swallowing similar barbs. Perhaps it was Julian's solid presence beside her. Perhaps she was simply exhausted with pretending to be invisible. Quiet, yes, she agreed pleasantly. I found silence often reveals more than conversation, Lady Caroline. One notices the most fascinating things when one simply observes. Caroline's perfect smile tightened. Indeed, and what fascinating things have you observed? Oh, countless things. For instance, I've observed that some people confuse attention with genuine interest. That desperation, no matter how beautifully packaged, remains desperation. That manufactured charm is considerably less appealing than authentic character. Julian made a sound that was either a cough or a suppressed laugh. Caroline's face flushed pink. How extraordinarily rude, Lady Jasmine. Your Grace, surely you don't condone such. I find Lady Jasmine's honesty refreshing, Julian interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of steel beneath the polite tone. Now, if you'll truly excuse us, Lady Caroline, we have other engagements. He guided the horses past Caroline's phaeton with deliberate care, leaving her staring after them with an expression that promised retribution. Once out of earshot, Julian turned to Jasmine with undisguised admiration. That was magnificent. Absolutely magnificent. That was appalling, Jasmine protested, her heart racing. I was unspeakably rude to her. She was condescending to you first. You simply refused to accept it. There's a difference. The ton will crucify me for it. The ton can go hang, he said firmly. Besides, within a week you'll be seen as witty rather than rude. That's how these things work when you're courting a duke. He said it so matter-of-factly that Jasmine almost believed him.